A woman from the HOA storms up and tells me I am trespassing on my own beach. For a second, I just stared at her, half convinced I'd misheard. The wind was calm, the water soft against the sand, and yet here stood this woman, clutching a clipboard like a sword, declaring ownership over something that's been in my family for decades. There's a special kind of disbelief that hits you when someone confidently tells you that your truth isn't real. I wasn't angry, not yet. Mostly, I was amused, because deep down, I already knew this was about to become one of those stories that people wouldn't believe unless they saw it happen. You know that moment when life throws you into a situation so absurd, it borders on comedy? That was this. She wasn't just mistaken. She was absolutely certain. Her tone had that flavor of authority only people who've never been challenged tend to develop. And as she talked, as she pointed toward my sand and declared it community property, I couldn't help but think, how many times do people like this get away with it simply because no one pushes back? Guys, you're not going to believe how far she took it. I mean, I thought this would be one of those quick, awkward misunderstandings you laugh off later. But no, this turned into a full-blown power struggle, the kind that shows you how fragile the line is between confidence and delusion. It's almost fascinating how entitlement can masquerade as certainty, how rules meant to protect can twist into tools of control. And that's the thing about some HOAs. They start as neighborhood organizers, but for a few, it becomes a stage to play dictator. So as she stood there, calling me a trespasser on my own property, I made a choice. I wasn't going to match her energy. I wasn't going to yell. I was going to do something far more unsettling. Stay calm, stay factual, and let her arrogance unfold under its own weight. Because sometimes, the best way to expose nonsense is to let it keep talking. And trust me, she kept talking. The beach has always felt like a part of my DNA. It wasn't something I bought on a whim or stumbled into. It was something I inherited, a quiet legacy passed down from my grandfather. When I was a kid, I used to walk those same sands with him, watching the waves swallow our footprints, listening to him talk about how peace is a rare kind of wealth. Back then, this stretch of shoreline wasn't surrounded by vacation homes or shiny HOA signs. It was just seagrass, driftwood, and the sound of water that seemed to go on forever. When he passed, the property came to me, not just as land, but as a responsibility, a promise to protect something simple and real in a world that keeps trying to complicate everything. It's not a mansion or some exclusive estate. It's a modest beach house tucked just far enough from the tide to stay dry, with a small wooden deck that faces the horizon. The kind of place where mornings smell like salt and coffee, and nights hum with the soft rhythm of waves. It's the kind of quiet that resets you, the kind that makes you feel small in the best way. I never thought a place so peaceful could ever become a battlefield. But here's the irony. Peaceful places are often surrounded by chaos. On one side of my property line lies the edge of a massive HOA community. Hundreds of homes, all neatly stacked like a real estate catalog, each with matching mailboxes and carefully worded rules about what color your shutters can be. Their beach access is about 200 feet down, clearly marked by big, confident signs claiming community entrance. Mine, in contrast, has two small wooden markers, one at each end, weathered by time but still legible, private property. It's never been about keeping people out, only about keeping boundaries clear. I've always tried to be the kind of neighbor who assumes good intentions. If someone wandered a little too far down the shoreline, I'd simply wave, walk over, and explain kindly that they'd crossed into private land. Most people were apologetic. some even embarrassed. I'd usually smile, tell them no harm done, and we'd part ways peacefully. No yelling, no scene, because at the end of the day, it's just a strip of sand. What matters more is how you handle yourself when someone steps over a line, literally or otherwise. Maybe that's why I've never installed fences or cameras or taken it too seriously. I believed that as long as I treated others with respect, they'd return the same. But that's the illusion that comfort builds. It makes you forget how quickly reason can crumble in the face of entitlement. My grandfather used to say that property lines are simple, but people's egos are complicated. I never understood what he meant until that weekend. When my wife and I arrived for a quiet few days by the water, I felt that same nostalgic calm I'd known since childhood. The house looked the same, the sand felt the same, and for a moment, life was beautifully predictable. We unpacked, opened the windows to let the ocean air drift in, and laughed about how city noise felt like a bad dream we'd just woken up from. The world felt small, safe, and ours again. But that sense of belonging is fragile, isn't it? You can spend years nurturing peace, and it takes only one stranger's arrogance to fracture it. I didn't know it yet, but this particular weekend was going to test everything I thought I knew about patience, boundaries, and ownership. Not just the ownership of a property, but of my voice. Because when someone looks you in the eye and tells you that your truth doesn't exist, you either shrink or you rise. Looking back, I realized there were hints. A few lingering stares from passing walkers, a couple of HOA folks who treated my house like a curiosity. Maybe they'd already started telling stories about the extra land next to the community. Maybe the myth of shared ownership had already taken root. But at the time, I didn't think much of it. I just wanted to read my book, listen to the waves, and remember why my grandfather loved this place. I didn't come here to fight anyone. I came here to breathe, to honor something he built long before HOAs, long before people started thinking they could regulate sunsets and shoreline. But peace, like any good thing, draws attention. And that weekend, attention arrived wearing a visor, holding a clipboard, and speaking in the language of authority. The kind that mistakes volume for truth. And as I'd soon learn, this quiet strip of sand, this inheritance of calm, was about to turn into a lesson I'd never forget. It started quietly, the way most storms do. The morning had that stillness that only exists at the edge of the ocean. No traffic, no voices, just the rhythm of the tide and the occasional cry of a gull. I remember thinking it was the kind of peace you can't buy, the kind that has to be earned by leaving the rest of the world behind. I had my chair in the sand, coffee in hand, book open. The sun had just started warming the air, and for a while, time didn't feel real. But then I heard it. The distant sound of chatter, laughter, and the shuffle of coolers dragging through sand. At first, I didn't even look up. The beach attracts wanderers, and I'd long stopped caring when people strolled by. But then the sound grew louder, closer, heavier, until it wasn't just passing through. It was claiming space. When I finally looked up, I saw them. A group of maybe 15 people, dressed in the kind of matching casual comfort that screams, organized outing. They were setting up camp right in front of my house. Umbrellas, chairs, even a speaker. It was like watching a slow-motion takeover of your living room while you still sitting in it. At first, I thought it had to be a mistake. There was no malice in that first thought, just disbelief. So, I stood, brushed the sand off, and walked toward them with the same polite tone I'd used a dozen times before. "Hey folks," I said, Just wanted to let you know, this section of the beach is private property. The HOA access is about 200 feet that way. Simple, calm, factual. The kind of statement that should have solved everything. One man looked up at me, squinting against the sun, clearly confused. He nodded, halfway understanding. I thought that would be the end of it, until she appeared. Karen. Every neighborhood seems to have one, but this one arrived like she'd been waiting her whole life for this stage. She wore the kind of visor that only exists to declare authority and a shirt embroidered with the HOA logo like a badge of rank. Her stride was sharp, her tone clipped, and before she even spoke, I could feel the chill that comes when someone's ego enters the conversation first. "Excuse me," she said, voice dripping with that practiced politeness that's just a few words away from condescension. "Who exactly are you?" For a moment, I thought it was a genuine question, so I smiled. "I'm the property owner," I said. "This section of beach isn't part of the HOA." She didn't blink. "That's not correct," she replied, crossing her arms. "This is community property. I'm on the HOA board. I think I know where our property lines are." There it was, the tone of someone who confuses their title with truth. I stayed calm, tried again. "I completely understand the confusion. The HOA's beach access is right over there." I pointed down the shoreline, but she didn't even follow my hand. "Those signs are old," she snapped. "This beach belongs to the community now. I've been coming here for 8 years, and no one's ever said anything before." And that, when I felt it, that small twist in the gut when you realize reason one, to work here. Because she wasn't looking for facts, she was looking for control. Around us, her group had started to quiet down, watching. The air thickened with that awkward tension people feel when they know someone in the wrong but want to get involved. It's fascinating, really, how quickly group dynamics shift. You could almost see the calculation on their faces. Follow the confident one or the calm one. And confidence, even when it's misplaced, can be contagious. Karen turned to her group and said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "Don't worry, everyone. This man is confused about the property lines. You can set up wherever you want." Her words carried the finality of a judge's verdict. In a single sentence, she had flipped the story, painting me as the intruder, the outsider, the kind of social maneuver that turns truth into theater. For a second, I just stood there, caught between disbelief and absurdity. It's strange how humiliation can sneak up on you, not as an explosion, but as a quiet realization that people are watching you lose control of your own space. I could have shouted. I could have matched her arrogance with volume. But something inside me whispered, "Don't give her that." So instead, I steadied my voice. "Ma'am," I said, "this is private property. I have the deed, the survey, and the markers are right there." I gestured again, still calm, still giving her a chance to back down gracefully. She didn't. "Oh, please," she scoffed. "I know the owner of this property, and you're not him." I actually laughed, because what else do you do when someone insists you're a stranger in your own home? "You know the owner?" I asked. "Yes," she said smugly. "His name is Robert. He's an older gentleman, very kind, and he doesn't mind us using this beach." And there it was, the twist. Robert was my grandfather. The man she claimed to know had been gone for years. I told her that gently, thinking maybe now she'd understand. "Robert was my grandfather," I said. "He passed away, and I inherited the property." But Karen wasn't built to retreat. She rolled her eyes. "How convenient. Sure you did. Look, you can't just come down here and make up stories." Behind her, a few of her group shifted uneasily, their certainty beginning to crack. But she doubled down, pointing toward my house as if that settled it. "We've been using this beach for years," she said. "That gives us rights." It's a fascinating thing, how people mistake repetition for entitlement. Use something long enough, and they start believing it's theirs. I could feel the heat rising, but not from anger, from disbelief. This was more than trespassing. It was a performance of power. And the audience? A crowd that didn't know who to believe. That's the worst part of being challenged publicly. It's not about who's right. It's about who stays composed when everyone's watching. I looked around at the faces, the unease, the whispered comments. Some were already uncomfortable. Others were clearly waiting for the drama to unfold. And that's when it clicked. This wasn't just about land. It was about identity. She needed to be right because her status depended on it. I needed to stay calm because my dignity did. So I took a slow breath, met her gaze, and said, "All right then. You want to settle this? Let's call the owner." The way her expression shifted, half smug, half suspicious, was the first hint that this story was about to take a turn she'd never forget. What she didn't realize was that she'd just handed me the perfect setup. Because sometimes life doesn't give you justice. You have to let arrogance build its own trap. And she was walking right into hers. Karen folded her arms and said it with the kind of smug certainty only someone deeply wrong could muster. "Why don't we just call the real owner?" she said, chin tilted, eyes scanning me like I was a kid caught lying about something obvious. You know that feeling when someone's arrogance is so profound it almost becomes entertaining? That was me, standing there on my own property, watching a woman double down on a delusion with Olympic-level confidence. She really believed she'd caught me in some grand lie. Her group looked from her to me like spectators at a chess match, waiting for the next move. And that's when something in me shifted. From disbelief to opportunity. I smiled, not the sarcastic kind, but the slow, calm one that says, "You sure you want to do this?" "You want to call the owner?" I asked, keeping my tone as neutral as possible. "Yes," she said, crossing her arms tighter, her voice climbing like she was trying to convince herself too. "Call Robert. He'll straighten this out." She actually said his name, like invoking my grandfather was a trump card. For a moment, the air between us felt heavy with irony. She had no idea how right she was, just about 50 years too late. "All right then," I said, pulling my phone from my pocket. Her expression flickered between triumph and suspicion. That subtle twitch people get when they sense they've gone too far, but to stop performing. I turned to my wife, who'd been quietly watching, and said loudly enough for everyone to hear, "Honey, she wants me to call the property owner. Can you go ahead and do that for her?" My wife didn't miss a beat. She pulled out her phone, tapped a few times, and dialed. A second later, my phone started ringing in my hand. The sound was sharp, echoing through the silence like the punchline to a joke nobody saw coming. You could almost hear the collective thought forming in the group's mind. "Wait. What?" Karen's face began to morph. First confusion, then disbelief, and finally the crimson flush of embarrassment. It spread slowly, like sunrise over an empty horizon. For a few long seconds, no one spoke. I could feel the tension crackling in the air, that delicious mix of second-hand awkwardness and dawning realization. And I'll admit, I savored it a little. Not out of cruelty, but out of justice. This wasn't just about proving a point. It was about reclaiming truth from someone who twisted it into their playground. I answered my phone, kept it on speaker, and said, "Hi, this is the owner speaking." My wife, playing along perfectly, said into her receiver, "Yes, just confirming. This is the owner of the beachfront property." Karen blinked like she'd just seen a magic trick she didn't understand. For a moment, I almost felt bad for her. Almost. "Well," I said, still calm, "now that we've got the owner on the line, does that clear things up?" She stammered, reaching for a retort that wouldn't come. "That doesn't prove anything," she said, her voice cracking under the weight of her own stubbornness. "Anyone could fake that." And there it was, the last refuge of denial, pretending reality itself is counterfeit. I could have stopped there, but something told me she needed to see the truth in black and white. So I opened my email app, scrolled for a second, and held out my phone. "Here's a property tax confirmation from 3 months ago," I said. "My name, my address, and the parcel number. Would you like me to show you the deed, too? It's inside." Her eyes flicked down to the screen, scanning for something to disprove, but it was all there. The official county header, the timestamp, the exact address. I could see the calculation happening behind her eyes, the crumbling of certainty, the desperate search for a new angle. "Those could be fake," she muttered weakly, but her voice had lost its conviction. Her group wasn't buying it either. A few had started packing their chairs. One older man mumbled, "Karen, maybe we should just head down to the HOA section." That the-moment authority turns into isolation. When people who once looked to you for confidence start avoiding eye contact. Karen straightened, clinging to what was left of her dignity. "I'm still not convinced," she said, but the words sounded hollow, like an echo that didn't know where to land. My wife stepped forward then, calm but firm. "We can call the county recorder's office right now," she said. "They have every ownership record on file. Would that make you feel better?" The offer hung in the air like an open hand. Karen didn't take it. She just stood there, deflated, but unwilling to admit defeat. The silence that followed was uncomfortable, even for me. Part of me wanted to let it end there, to let her walk away and save face. But she'd crossed more than a property line. She'd crossed into the kind of arrogance that thrives when left unchallenged. So I said, "You know, I really do admire your confidence. You were ready to rewrite history on the spot. But the thing about truth is, it doesn't care who believes it." A few chuckles rippled through her group. I didn't need to add anything else. The power dynamic had flipped. You could feel the shift. Her posture softened. Her tone lost its edge. She muttered something about miscommunication, trying to retreat gracefully. But there's no graceful retreat when you've built your argument on quicksand. The only thing left is silence. And silence, when earned through calm persistence, is its own kind of victory. I turned back toward my chair, sat down, and took a slow sip of my now cold coffee. The beach was quiet again, except for the faint sound of folding chairs and the shuffle of retreating footsteps. But before they were fully gone, Karen turned one last time, her face caught between frustration and disbelief. "You'll regret this," she said, the words more reflex than threat. I didn't reply. Sometimes silence is the most eloquent response. It lets the other person hear the echo of their own nonsense. When they were finally out of sight, my wife laughed, the kind of laugh that comes from relief and disbelief all at once. "You handled that better than I would have," she said. I smiled, still watching the waves. "It's easy when you know the truth," I said. And it was true. Because there's a quiet power in letting arrogance expose itself. You don't have to shout. You don't have to prove your worth. You just have to stand there long enough for the truth to do its own work. Later that day, I replayed the whole thing in my head, thinking about how often people like Karen move through the world unchecked. How many times they've steamrolled someone quieter, less confident, someone who didn't have the proof handy or the patience to stand firm. That's the part that stuck with me. Because it is never just about one person being wrong. It is about what happens when we stop letting people rewrite reality for their convenience. The irony is, she thought she was defending her community. But in that moment, she became the exact thing that fractures communities. Entitlement dressed up as righteousness. And the funniest part? She handed me the perfect setup to expose it. All on her own. Justice, when it arrives with a touch of irony, always feels cleaner somehow. It doesn't come from revenge. It comes from restraint. And that's what makes it satisfying. So, yes, Karen got her proof. Not because I shouted her down, but because I let her ego walk itself right into a wall. And if there's a lesson in that, it's this. Sometimes you don't win by fighting harder. You win by standing still, letting the truth echo louder than any argument ever could. She didn't leave. Even after the phone call stunt collapsed, she planted her feet in the sand like she was guarding a fortress and declared, with new volume, that community rights superseded whatever papers I thought I had. It was almost impressive, the way certainty can regenerate after public embarrassment. Her group hovered behind her, half loyal, half uncomfortable, all of them waiting for someone else to blink first. I wanted to believe this could still end with a conversation, but there's a point where talking isn't clarity. It's camouflage for control. "Ma'am, this is private property. You've seen the documents," I said, each word measured. She shook her head and countered with phrases that sounded official until you inspected them. Heritage use, public benefit, neighbors' consensus. That's the thing about vague authority. Say it confidently, and a crowd will nod along. I reminded myself that dignity is a choice. You can wrestle in the sand with someone's ego, or you can step out of the arena. I stepped out. I told her I'd be calling the non-emergency line, and she smirked like I'd just confirmed her favorite plot twist. The call felt surprisingly steadying. I described the situation plainly. Trespassers on clearly marked private beachfront, prior attempts to resolve peacefully, documents on hand. The dispatcher listened, asked practical questions, then said an officer would come by. While we waited, the beach's quiet returned in fragments. The tide, the gulls, the shuffle of people reconsidering their weekend plans. A family with kids packed quietly. An older man avoided Karen's eyes and retreated toward the HOA access. Social gravity was shifting. Karen, however, doubled down. She dialed someone, spoke in clipped tones about board authority, then announced to no one in particular that she had their attorney on speed dial. "He'll prove it's a community easement," she promised. I almost admired the stamina, but certainty without evidence is just adrenaline in a blazer. I sat back in my chair, sipped coffee gone cold, and reminded myself I wasn't here to win a debate. I was here to maintain reality. The cruiser pulled up near the house exactly when the day felt ready for a turn. The officer walked down to the sand and read the scene in a single sweep. Two clusters of people, one visibly defensive, one quiet and tired. He asked for IDs, then asked me for documents. I had the folder ready. Deed transferring title from my grandfather's estate. The survey with boundary lines highlighted. Tax bill with parcel number. He looked closely, asked a few specific questions only someone competent would ask, and nodded. Precision has a sound. It's the absence of drama. What followed was a masterclass in professional patience. Karen launched into her speech. Years of use, community understanding, the board's alleged agreement with my grandfather. The officer stayed neutral, asked for written proof, and waited. She had none. He asked whether any easement had been recorded with the county. She hesitated, said she believed so. He offered to call and check. Her silence was answer enough. Authority, when it's real, doesn't shout. It verifies. He returned to me, voice even. Sir, based on the documents and the markers, this is your private property. They need to move to their designated access. Simple. Definitive. More relieving than I expected. He walked back to Karen and explained the same thing, clearly, calmly, with that gentle firmness that leaves no room for interpretation. Her jaw tightened. She asked to make a few more calls. He said she was free to call anyone she liked, but she and her group needed to relocate now or risk a trespass report. That's when the packing began. I wish I could say it was graceful. It wasn't. She packed like she was in a rage-cleaning montage, umbrellas yanked from the ground, chairs collapsing with theatrical sighs, cooler lids slamming like punctuation marks. A few in her group avoided my eyes entirely. The social hangover of following the loudest voice in the room. The officer stayed nearby, not threatening, simply present. Presence, when it carries authority, is its own gravity. As they moved down the beach toward the HOA section, the energy shifted from confrontation to that strange hush after a storm. My wife and I exhaled at the same time, a synchronized release that felt like handing back a weight we never agreed to carry. I thanked the officer. He handed me a card with the incident number and said, "If you have further issues, call us." It was a small sentence, but it rebuilt something inside me. When someone tries to erase your ownership, you don't just defend land, you defend the right to be believed on it. Walking back to my chair, I thought about how easily this could have gone differently if I'd matched her escalation. It's tempting to meet force with force, to let the heat of humiliation turn into fire. But calm is not surrender. It's strategy. You don't always need a sharper sword. Sometimes you just need a cleaner mirror. Let people see themselves. Let the rules speak. Let the truth do its quiet work. The dopamine rush isn't from the argument. It's from the resolution. Maybe that's why this ending felt so satisfying. Fairness wasn't abstract. It materialized right there on the sand. Social justice isn't always headlines and courtrooms. Sometimes it's a single officer saying, "This is your line. It will be respected." And sometimes it's the look on a person's face when they realize the performance has ended and the audience has moved on. The beach returned to its original programming. Waves, wind, the unbothered horizon. I took another sip of coffee and finally tasted calm again. Not because I won a fight, but because the truth, verified, let the day breathe. I thought that once the officer left, that would be the end of it. Most people, after being told they're wrong by someone in uniform, tend to retreat quietly and nurse their embarrassment. But Karen and her beloved HOA, they took it personally. A few days later, a letter showed up in my mailbox. Formal stationery, community logo embossed at the top, and that condescending tone of forced politeness that only people in power seem to master. It began with, "We believe there has been a misunderstanding regarding the use of the shared beach space." Shared. That single word carried the same arrogance as her visor and clipboard. They weren't apologizing. They were rebranding their trespass as a collective oversight. The letter went on to suggest that, as a gesture of goodwill, I should grant the community occasional access to my beachfront. It even dressed the request in emotional language about neighborly unity and preserving community values. You'd think they were asking to borrow a cup of sugar, not permanent access to private property. I showed it to my wife, and she laughed. The kind of laugh that says, they really don't know who they're dealing with. I ignored it at first, hoping silence would communicate what politeness no longer could. But ignoring arrogance is like ignoring a weed. It only convinces it to grow. 2 weeks later, another letter arrived, this one colder. Gone were the warm words about community. Now it spoke of previous agreements and verbal permissions allegedly granted by the former owner. That's when I realized this wasn't about confusion anymore. It was strategy. They were trying to rewrite history, using my grandfather's memory as ammunition. The HOA was building a narrative that decades of casual friendliness somehow amounted to legal entitlement. It's a common tactic, actually. They call it prescriptive easement. In simple terms, if someone uses your property openly and without your objection for a long enough period, they might claim a legal right to continue doing so. But that's the key word: without objection. My family never surrendered that right. My grandfather allowed kindness, not ownership. Still, they kept pushing. Another envelope, this time from an attorney representing the HOA. You could almost smell the smugness through the paper. The letter claimed they had grounds to assert an easement by prescription, and that they would pursue all legal remedies available. Reading it, I felt a flicker of anger, but also clarity. This wasn't just about a strip of sand. It was about principle. If you give an inch to entitlement, it doesn't stop at the inch. It maps out the whole mile. So I called my attorney, a man who has the rare gift of turning logic into a weapon. I explained everything, forwarded the letters, and waited. When he called back, his tone carried that confident amusement only professionals get when they know they're about to dismantle something flimsy. "They don't have a case," he said. "They're bluffing." And then he explained, step by step, how the law actually works. To claim an easement, the HOA would need proof of continuous, open, and hostile use for a specific number of years, without the owner's permission. But my grandfather had given them permission occasionally, which legally destroys the hostile requirement. In simpler terms, politeness canceled their argument. The very decency they were exploiting was the thing that protected us. He drafted a response letter that was a masterpiece of precision. No emotion, no sarcasm, just logic sharp enough to draw blood. It outlined the flaws in their claim, cited property statutes, referenced the original deed, and ended with a warning. Continued harassment would result in a counterclaim for legal fees and defamation. Reading it felt like watching someone cleanly dismantle a house of cards with one breath. Within a week, the HOA's tone shifted from confident to cautious. Their next letter was shorter, vaguer, full of further review and miscommunication. Translation: they'd realized they'd lost, and yet I couldn't help but marvel at the psychology behind it. Why do some people, when faced with facts, double down instead of stepping back? Maybe because conceding means confronting who they really are, people who mistake control for contribution. Karen didn't want justice. She wanted validation. The HOA didn't want access. They wanted submission. But that's where clarity becomes power. Once you understand someone's motive, you stop reacting to their noise and start responding with strategy. I began to see the whole episode as a lesson in boundaries, literal and emotional. Property lines are easy to mark with stakes and signs. Personal lines are harder. You can't nail those into the ground. You have to reinforce them with consistency, confidence, and calm. My attorney's letter wasn't just a legal win, it was a psychological one. It proved that truth, when framed with authority and restraint, speaks louder than outrage. It's easy to yell when you're right. It's harder and far more effective to stay still and let the evidence do the shouting for you. A few days later, the HOA president called. His voice was diplomatic, cautious. He said there had been a misunderstanding and that they valued peaceful neighborly relations. He didn't apologize directly, people like that rarely do, but his tone carried the subtle humility of someone who's just been cornered by reality. I thanked him, kept my voice even, and reminded him that I had no interest in conflict, only respect for boundaries. That was the end of it, officially, anyway. But here's what most people miss about stories like this. The real victory isn't in proving someone wrong. It's in proving to yourself that you can stand firm without losing grace. The HOA's intimidation tactics could have pulled me into their drama, made me defensive, emotional, reactive. But when you trade outrage for composure, you stop playing their game. You build your own. And that shift, from reacting to leading, is where empowerment begins. Looking back, I realized the satisfaction didn't come from seeing them retreat. It came from knowing I handled it without letting anger dictate the outcome. Justice, when it's earned through intellect instead of aggression, lingers longer. It reinforces something deeper than pride. It reinforces identity. You don't just own the property, you own your peace. And when logic dismantles entitlement, it doesn't just protect your land. It restores your faith that truth, even in a noisy world, still has the final word. When the phone rang again a few weeks later, I expected more trouble. My first thought was that the HOA had found some new loophole, another half-baked argument to reclaim my beach. But the voice on the other end wasn't defensive this time. It was tired, sincere, even a little embarrassed. It was the HOA president. He started with a pause long enough to make me curious, then said, "I wanted to personally apologize for how everything was handled." I didn't interrupt him. I could hear the weight in his voice, that mixture of regret and self-preservation you only hear from someone realizing they've been on the wrong side of reason. He went on to explain that the board had reviewed the situation, that the letters, the legal threats, all of it had been the result of one person's overzealous leadership. His words, not mine. He told me Karen had been officially removed from the board after multiple complaints, not just because of my incident, but because this had apparently been her pattern for years. She was the type to mistake power for purpose, authority for ownership, and the irony wasn't lost on me. The woman who had tried to claim my property now had no authority even within her own. It wasn't revenge, it was symmetry. As he spoke, I didn't feel the triumph I thought I would. There was no spark of, "I told you so," no taste of victory. Instead, there was a calm sense of balance being restored. Sometimes justice doesn't roar, it exhales. I told him I appreciated his apology, and that I held no grudges. All I wanted was mutual respect and peace. That seemed to catch him off guard, maybe because people like Karen thrive on conflict, and when you refuse to keep fighting, you remove their fuel. He thanked me again and said the HOA would be putting up clearer signage to mark where their property ended and mine began. A small step, but a meaningful one. Boundaries, once violated, always feel sacred once they're repaired. When I hung up, I walked down to the beach. It was quiet again, just wind, gulls, and the tide stretching endlessly across the horizon. The sand looked the same as it always had, but it felt different now. Not because anything physical had changed, but because the peace that returned was earned. You can't appreciate calm until you've defended it. I sat in my chair, the same one from that morning months ago, and realized something subtle but powerful. The situation hadn't just been about property. It had been about identity, about how easily someone else's confidence can make you question your own truth, and how powerful it feels when you reclaim it, not by shouting, but by standing still. A funny thing happens when people finally see reason. You start to notice how much energy you'd been spending proving what you already knew. Spending proving what? All that frustration, all that tension, gone in an instant, replaced by something quieter and more valuable. Perspective. Sometimes the best revenge isn't humiliation or punishment. It's stability. It's showing that you can hold your ground without losing your composure. And as I looked out at the waves, I couldn't help but smile at the poetic ending. The woman who told me I didn't to belong had been voted out by the very community she claimed to represent. My wife joined me a few minutes later, coffee in hand, and we sat together watching the water. She teased me gently, saying, "See? You didn't even have to raise your voice." And she was right. There's something deeply satisfying about knowing that logic, patience, and a little paperwork can do what anger never could. I laughed, telling her, sometimes the best revenge is just being right in writing. Because in the end, that's all it took. A few lines of ink and the discipline to let the truth speak for itself. Since then, the beach has gone back to being what it was always meant to be. A place of peace. Occasionally, I'll see a few HOA families down by their section, and they wave politely. The tension's gone. Respect has taken its place. And that's the real win. Not the legal victory, not even the apology, but the quiet understanding that peace doesn't need to be loud to be powerful. If there's a lesson in all this, it's simple. You don't always need to fight fire with fire. Sometimes you just have to outlast the smoke. Entitlement burns fast. Truth endures. And as the tide came in, washing over the footprints of that long summer's conflict, I felt something close. Not just the story, but the cycle. The return home. Full circle. And speaking of ridiculous HOA moments, just wait till you hear the next one. Let's just say this time, the power trip doesn't end on the beach. It ends in the dumpster. And that's how it all came full circle. Calm restored, truth intact, and one less HOA warrior patrolling the sand. If you've made it this far, thank you for sticking with me through the twists, the absurdity, and the quiet victory at the end. Stories like this remind me that sometimes the smallest battles, those over a few feet of beach, a parking space, or even a bit of peace, carry the biggest lessons. It's never just about who's right on paper. It's about who can keep their composure when everything around them turns into noise. If you've ever had to deal with your own version of a Karen or an HOA that overstepped its boundaries, I'd love to hear about it. Drop your story in the comments, because these tales aren't just entertainment. They're therapy. Every time one of you shares what happened to you, it reminds someone else that they're not alone in standing up to entitlement. And honestly, I think that's what makes this community so powerful. We don't just laugh at these stories. We learn from them. We remind each other that staying calm, grounded, and factual isn't weakness. It's mastery. If this story left you grinning, frustrated, or just a little more patient than before, hit that like button so the algorithm knows we're not done yet. Because trust me, the next story is one you don't want to miss. Let's just say it involves another power-hungry HOA member, a dumpster, and a very creative dose of karma. Until then, stay kind, stay calm, and remember, sometimes the best revenge really is just keeping your peace.